Services and find out what's really happening there. So Justin Estep, who will be our speaker, I met him up in Silverdale a couple months ago, 6 weeks ago, and told him we'd like to have him come to our church and kind of tell us what's going on. You'll see his position up here, and he'll explain a little bit more how he ended up in the Northwest. So welcome to Justin.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is Justin Estep. I am the, as it says up here, Director of Refugee and Immigrant Services at Lutheran Community Services Northwest. I actually began in this position back in March, working remotely from Austin, Texas. I'm originally from Houston, spent the last 16 years living in Austin, where at first I was an immigration attorney with a private law firm for about 4.5 years, did some pro bono work, felt like I got enough knowledge to be dangerous and decided to jump over to the nonprofit world as the Director of Legal Services at Catholic Charities in Austin, Immigrant Legal Services, and then eventually taking on Refugee Support Services as well, which is slightly different than reception and placement. We're the services both here at LCS and what I did at Catholic Charities after that first 90 days. So we provide the additional support services that you'll see in the presentation can go up to 5 years. After working there for a decade at Catholic Charities in Austin, I took the opportunity to come here and become the director for the Refugee and Immigrant Services at LCSNW, and we moved here in June, just in time to enjoy the absolutely perfect weather that y'all have had. And I was just mentioning I'm getting used to the 4:30 night time. That's definitely new, even with the previous daylight savings back in Austin. But to be honest, it beats 4 or 5 months of 100+ degree weather, which is similar to what we were having before I came here. And I was just mentioning this past Friday we had an all-time high of 92 degrees in Austin. So very much happy to be here and not paying those electric bills. But it's been fantastic working at LCSNW now for about 6 months. I'll, at the end, go over some of the additional things that we're doing specifically at LCSNW, but just a quick overview of my Refugee and Immigrant Services program. As I said, we are that post-reception and placement help, and we're not just here to assist refugees. We also assist immigrants of all different types, whether it's someone who's an asylee seeking asylum here on a special immigrant visa, and several other different designations. And we're hoping actually to expand due to the need over the next couple of years. So an example of some of the programs we have are refugee health navigation, helping folks who are here, asylum seekers, asylees, other folks that are looking for help navigating our medical system. We also provide housing for those folks that are going through the asylum process while they're waiting for their work permit, so that then we can hand it off to them and they can have housing moving forward. We also provide case management, legal services, and workshops. A recent example would be some Afghan women who we did a literacy class, a tech literacy class for, so that they could then improve their ability to get employment. So that's a quick overview. Today's presentation, though, is going to be in regards to the immigration system as a whole. As I mentioned at the beginning, I began my career as an immigration attorney doing mostly employment-based immigration for a law firm. And this is going to be about a 30,000-foot overview of the immigration system here in the United States. And then I'm going to go into some updates, both at the federal level and some benefits that are available for refugees and immigrants at the state level. Happy to answer questions throughout the presentation, or if you'd like to wait till the end, whatever you're most comfortable with, I'm happy to do. So with that, see if I can make sure this works. Awesome. There we go. Okay, so there are 3 basic types of immigration. There is family-based immigration, employment-based immigration, and then asylum and refugees. Our modern immigration system really begins after World War II. Previous to World War II, the American immigration system for most of its existence was Everybody can come in except for those folks that we specifically say can't. So for things like that, you might reference the Chinese Exclusion Act and other laws that have been passed in the past that have now been declared unconstitutional. But that's basically how American immigration worked from the inception of this country till about World War II. After World War II, given it was the largest movement of human beings in the history of the world and migrations all over the place, including the United States, we decided to really hardline codify our immigration law. That began with family-based immigration. So family-based immigration is where you are a U.S. citizen or permanent resident, and you have a certain qualified family member that you want to petition for to come to the United States. The idea behind that is that most folks, whenever they have an anchor in the community and come over here, are able to integrate and assimilate much quicker than otherwise. So that's where it began. And it also created what's called derivative status. So derivative status is where you derive your status from another individual. An example of this would be if I petitioned for my immigrant brother from Mexico to come to the United States and he was married with minor children, I would not have to petition for him and then have him petition for his wife and children. His wife and children in family-based immigration receive derivative status. They derive their status from him so that they can come over as a family unit. Now, the next level was employment-based immigration. The idea behind that is filling areas of the economy where there's not enough permanent residents or U.S. citizens. This was actually my focus for the first 4.5 years of my career when I worked at a law firm in Austin. Most of our clients were tech companies, energy companies, and you might have heard of the H-1B visa recently, and there's other visas, Ls for transfers between international companies. EB-5 is for investors. If you invest X amount of dollars into the US, you can actually be put on a pathway to permanent residency. So that was the idea behind employment-based immigration. Now, the final area that we didn't really finish until the Refugee Act of 1980 was asylees and refugees. And there is a distinction between those two groups of people. They are similar, but they are not the same. And essentially, beginning with laws and treaties after World War II, all the way up into 1980, we worked out everything as far as our modern refugee and asylee system. And that is how we ended up with the modern immigration system we have today. Now, one of the biggest questions and most, I guess, misunderstood terms in immigration is going to be status. So immigration status is what is your ability to claim to remain in the United States without being removed? How strong is that claim? Now, starting here on the left end of the slide and moving with the arrow all the way to the right, you start with someone who has the least claim to remain in the US, and slowly getting stronger and stronger claims to remain in the United States and to not be removable or classically called deported. So starting over here on the far left, someone who is undocumented. So undocumented can mean one of two things. One, which is what most people think about, which is number 2 here, is you entered without inspection, or EWI, E-W-I. That means you went around the border checkpoints, you not for a while, but previously you just got waved through when they asked if you were a US citizen and you were like sitting in the passenger seat, meaning that you weren't actually inspected, had a background check run at the border. So that's one group of undocumented individuals. The second group have overstayed their visas. And actually, classically, still to this day, the larger percentage of undocumented people in the US aren't folks that enter without inspection, but it's individuals that overstayed their short-term visas. So these visas could be what are called B1, B2 visitor visas. They could be the employment-based visas, the H-1Bs, just about any type student visas, a visa that have a time certain. Most, I think it was around 60 to 65%, the last count, our estimation, were here on overstaying their visas, expired visas, not entering without inspection. Now, the next level would be a visa holder. So, yes, did I see a hand?
Yes, does that make it really difficult to extend your visa, or is there another reason for that?
Is there another reason for?
For staying.
Oh,
staying visa.
Yes, most folks. Yeah, yes, it depends on the visa though. So for example, a visitor visa, Sometimes you can extend it, but if you ask for too many extensions, they're going to be, well, you're not a visitor anymore, and they'll start denying those extensions. Other ones have it built in, like an H-1B visa allows for one extension, and then you're not allowed to extend it anymore unless your company then sponsors you for a permanent resident card, which is much more difficult, much more expensive. You have to prove that there's not someone out there and advertise for that same position. So yes, it's difficult to renew in general, but most folks, let's say, come here on a visitor visa or a temporary work visa, and then it's too dangerous to go home, so they just stay here and overstay their visa. That's a great question, by the way. And feel free, like I said, as we go along this presentation, to ask me questions. So a visa holder, that is someone who, with a visa, has the permission to come to the border and ask permission to be let into the United States. A visa is not a guarantee. That's an important distinction. A visa allows you to come to the border of most countries, including the US, and ask permission to enter for that specific reason. So for example, I mentioned the B1, B2 visitor visa. That visa does not allow for work authorization. So if you come to the border with a B1, B2 visa, and you go through Customs and Border Protection, and the officer asks you, what are you here for? And you have a B1, B2 visa in your passport, and you say, I'm here to work. That officer most likely will spin you right around and put you back on the plane and say you must return to your country of origin because a B1, B2 visitor visa does not allow you to work. Now, you can still come for a conference. That's one of the visas used to come for business conferences. And that's why when I worked at the law firm, when we had a large group of folks who were helping get visas to come for conferences, we would be very explicit, say, you're coming for a conference, don't say you're coming here to work, because you won't be able to attend your conference and you'll have to buy another plane ticket. So a visa only allows you to ask permission for that specific reason, and if the officer believes that you don't have a good reason, they can turn you around. Yes?
Are visitor visas required now for people who are just tourists?
So it depends. There are some countries, like a lot of European countries, that are on the visa waiver program, where you don't necessarily need a visa. They just essentially run a background check on you through your passport. But for many countries, like even from Mexico, to enter the US, you have to apply for a visitor visa. And to obtain those visitor visas, especially if you're coming from countries with a high degree of immigration to the US, then they have a lot of requirements. They want to know, do you own property in your home country? Do you have steady income? They can look at your bank accounts. Do you have ties to the community? Because essentially the US wants to ensure it's actually a visitor visa and that you'll return. Excellent questions. So let's say you do have a valid visa. You are allowed to enter the US. What type of visa? There's really two major categories. There are non-immigrant visas and immigrant visas. Non-immigrant visa simply means folks that are here for a temporary amount of time. Again, the ones I've already mentioned, visitor visas, student visas, temporary work visas, that sort of thing. An immigrant visa means you are on the pathway to get lawful permanent residency, which is the next category. Now, you can be a non-immigrant when you enter and then switch to an immigrant visa if that condition changes in your life. One of the most common examples is someone who arrives to the US on a non-immigrant student visa, goes to college, like many of us have or many of us know about, meets the spouse at college. That spouse happens to be a US citizen. Well, that circumstances change because whenever that individual arrived, they were here to be a student, but then they fell in love with a US citizen and the US citizen has now petitioned for them. So due to that change in circumstance, they can now switch to an immigrant visa based on marriage. But some folks just come in straight on an immigrant visa. That's where you can have like a fiancé visa and they come over and then you get an immigrant visa based on marriage. You can petition just for the immigrant visa, let's say if you're married in a foreign country. Refugees, in the classical way, refugees have come through the system. They come on an immigrant visa and immediately get to go into permanent residency 1 year after arriving. So there is a distinction, but you can switch between the two. But if you get an immigrant visa, either when you arrive or after you get here, then your next step is always going to be permanent resident. This is a green card holder, resident alien. That all means the same thing. And just a side note, why is it called a green card? Well, whenever this was invented as a status and as a a pathway to eventual citizenship, when they issued the first cards, they were on green sheets of paper that you could tear away, like with little perforations around the end. And it was green for about a few years, like 3 or 4 years. And then for about 60 years, it wasn't green at all. But it was still called a green card. And then due to many additions recently, mostly around security, holograms and things, it kind of is green again. So it almost makes sense once more, but that's where the term green card comes from. Now there are still technically 2 types of permanent residents. There's a conditional permanent resident and just a permanent resident. Every pathway to permanent residency goes through number 2, except for 1. So it doesn't matter if you've got your permanent residency through asylum and refugee, through family-based, through employment-based, through an SIV visa for folks from Iraq and Afghanistan. Doesn't matter. You'll go straight to permanent resident if you're able to adjust to that status. The only folks that have to be a conditional one first is whenever it's based on a recent marriage. So if you have a recent marriage, you are a conditional permanent resident for the first 2 years. Once you start approaching that 2-year mark, you then apply to the US government to have those conditions removed. And this is actually an area where movies and pop culture get it right in a way about the immigration process. So if the government is concerned that this might be what is termed a green card marriage, meaning it's not a good faith marriage, they can call in those individuals, separate them in different rooms, and do the TV comedy thing where it's like, when does he brush his teeth? When does she go to bed? What's your children's names? All those different things. And if they don't think it's a good faith marriage, they can end it right there, and then that person is deported. Most of the time for our clients, they actually are involved in a good faith marriage. At least we would assume they are if we're taking their case. And those conditions then are removed once they prove it's a good faith marriage. And you can even actually get divorced in that short period of time as long as you showed that you entered into it as a good faith marriage, and then there might have been some abuse issues or whatever and you had to get divorced. So that does allow for that. But if you can prove it, then you switch to permanent residency, and then you just renew that card every 10 years. Now, it's like a driver's license. If your permanent resident card expires, it's not like you're no longer a permanent resident and you have to go through the whole process of adjusting again. You just have to, pay to renew your card. And certainly you can stay here in the US, you're still technically a permanent resident, but if you leave and you have an expired permanent resident card and you try to come back, that's going to be a problem. Now, similar to a driver's license, you don't have to take the test every time you renew, but you do have to have that actual unexpired license to drive. It's similar in that regard. But once you're a permanent resident, you can stay a permanent resident, renew your card every 10 years, forever and ever. For example, you never have to become a citizen. My brother-in-law, who married my sister, his mother is a Canadian national. She immigrated to the US with her family in the late 70s and has remained a Canadian citizen and a US permanent resident now for over 45 years. Completely fine. There are just some gives and some takes. So for her, she wanted to retain her Canadian passport, and Canada, unlike the US, in her situation wouldn't allow for dual citizenship if she became a US citizen. So sometimes it is allowed, it's different every case. So she decided to retain it. Now, while she, has certain benefits to that, she can retain her Canadian citizenship, she can't vote in a US election. She's never been able to. She, if for whatever reason the US government makes a law or she commits a crime severe enough, can still be deported even after being here for 45 years. Now, some folks decide not to do it, not just for passport reasons. Sometimes there's tax reasons, there's family dynamic reasons, whatever the case may be. But most folks go from permanent resident to citizen sometimes as soon as they can, sometimes 40 or 50 years down the line, like she has now begun the process too. So, finally, US citizen, strongest claim to remain in the US without deportation. Now, there are 3 ways that you can become a US citizen. Number 1, being born in the United States. That is in the Constitution. It is an amendment. It was part of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments that were added to the Constitution after the Civil War as a precondition for letting the southern states back into the Union. Essentially, those 3 amendments were for ex-slaves, making sure that they weren't completely disenfranchised and that they had to be paid for their work and things of that nature. So, as of that day, any person born in the US was automatically a US citizen. Now, there's a couple of exceptions. If you're an ambassador's kid, you don't receive U.S. citizenship if you're born here. But in general, it doesn't matter what your parents' heritage is. It doesn't matter if they got there yesterday. You are a U.S. citizen as soon as you're born here in the U.S. Now, so far. I guess, like, when we get to the federal updates section, you'll see a lot of things we have assumed are now being challenged, but so far is a good point. So, as far as the entire world, we are actually in the minority of having just natural-born citizenship. If you're born here on the country's soil, then you're a U.S. citizen. But we're actually in the majority in North and South America. So it's more of a traditional in, quote unquote, the new world, that you have folks that have their citizenship when they're born here, just because this has been such a highly immigrated place with an I for now, 400 or 500 years. So that's kind of more of a tradition in North and South America as opposed to the rest of the world. A lot of places in the world, for example, France, you can be born there, it doesn't mean you're automatically a French citizen. So just fun facts about where that actually is law. Naturalization, what I just described there, either going from undocumented or a visa holder all the way across, that's naturalization. I'll get into the details of that and actually some changes that have been made to that process here in the last several months that might be important if y'all know anyone working through the process. And finally is acquisition or derivation. I'll get into those details later, but they both essentially mean you're getting your U.S. citizenship through somebody else.
Could that be an employer?
No. Now you can get to U.S. citizenship eventually, but your employer part ends once they get you permanent residency. Once you're a permanent resident, then you're on your own. Now let's get back to talking about family-based immigration. This is still the #1 way to immigrate lawfully to the U.S. and classically has been. There's two different groups that can do it, U.S. citizens and lawful permanent residents. U.S. citizens just can't immigrate any relative. They're second cousins, they can't even do their first cousins. There are 4 distinct groups that they can immigrate. Siblings, children, parents, and spouses. That's it. So when you hear they're gonna start immigrating their great-grand-uncle, that's just not true. Now, one way you can stretch it is that, call it chain migration, and say a parent can then petition for their parents, and that's how you can get to great-great-grandma immigrating. But you'll see why that's kind of impractical given the wait times for a lot of these visas here in a little bit. Now, a permanent resident can also immigrate their spouses and their children, unmarried children under the age of 21. But that's it. This is another benefit of going from permanent resident to citizen. You can vote, you can't be deported unless you committed fraud on your citizenship application, and you can immigrate infinitely more relatives. Now, this is a clip from one of the more recent visa bulletins. So as far as family-based immigration goes, there are what are considered immediate relatives. That is like your spouse or your parents. But your adult children are not considered immediate relatives in this context. Your siblings, your adult siblings, are not considered immediate relatives. If you have an immediate relative, like a spouse, let's say, that person basically just has the time to process their what's called I-130 family-based petition and to come into the United States and either then apply to adjust their status or do it at a consulate. That, over the last several years has taken somewhere in the vicinity on average of 18 to 24 months. Now, if you're not an immediate relative, let's say a sibling of a U.S. citizen, well, you still use that same form, I-130, to petition for that foreign national sibling, but you have to use this, the visa bulletin. Now, you look on the left, those are family-sponsored categories. That's why they have an F in front of them. The F1, 3, and 4s are for U.S. citizens, immigrating relatives. F2A and F2B are for permanent residents. So let's just take F4, for example. That's siblings of U.S. citizens. Now, if you look at the top, you have a list of 4 countries and then basically a catch-all. And essentially what this is saying is under the family-based category, and then there's also an employment-based, to get permanent residency, we have 4 lines for these 4 countries because they have historically, until recently, been the 4 main areas of immigration into the U.S., and then literally every other recognized country falls into that first category. So let's say I have a brother in Mexico that I want to petition for. Well, it was 18 months ago, I petitioned, I've got my approval. The approval date is, November 9th, 2025. Well, every month, this Visa Bulletin's put out to let you know for what approval dates are now eligible to become permanent residents. So you can get your petition approved. That doesn't mean you're now going to be a permanent resident. You have to wait in the line. So let's say again, F4, that's siblings of US citizens. Let's go over to Mexico. Last month, they were letting in folks that had an approval in April of 2001. So that means if I have my approval today, that's going to be at least a 24 or 25 year wait. Now, I say at least because this does not go month to month in a similar cadence, depending on how many petitions were sent in those decades ago, and all of our artificial caps on family-based, employment-based, all types of immigration, this line builds up. So really, it's more of a 25 to 30 year wait. And then on top of that, if there are too many given out for whatever reason, this has happened in the past, it can actually retrogress. And if you miss the date, you have to wait until that date becomes current again. So if you're not paying attention every month to this release by the Department of State, then you could miss your chance and have to wait till it comes around again. So whenever I talk to folks about how the line is broken, whenever that's, they hear the line, everyone should wait in line, this is why I think most folks across all spectrums would say, we just need to reform this system. It no longer works. Sadly enough, the population numbers that a lot of our immigration laws are based on are from censuses in the 1950s. And we have not updated it since then because, as you might have noticed, not just recently, but classically, it's really hard to get immigration reform through both houses of Congress and the president. Yes?
So I'm noticing that the F2A visa, those seem to be more recent.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what is the F2A then?
So those are your spouses and children, minor children of permanent residents. So they're much sooner because they're spouses and minor children, but it's just permanent residents. It's not US citizens. So a permanent resident can't immigrate the F4 category. You have to be a US citizen to do that. Yes.
So you commented that this indicates that the system is broken. I would argue that it's working exactly as it was designed.
Yeah, I mean, that's very true. I mean, there has been there's a reason that it's been intractable, exactly, to get this changed. And folks have been asking for it since the 80s. That was the compromise was Reagan's Amnesty Act. And that's what a lot of people forget is that Ronald Reagan was a huge advocate for immigration. We'll get to a chart here. You'll see the explosion after the Refugee Act of 1980, how many refugees were brought in during that time period. But essentially what's happened is since that Amnesty Act, it's been, every time we even touch it, we did once under the Clinton administration in the 90s, it's even lighter and lighter touches because there's business interests, there's cultural interests, there's disagreement on where, what countries we should allow more or less folks in from. So yes, it's unfortunately, I think you're right, working pretty much how it was designed.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
Do all of the countries of the world have a chart or a line, or is it?
No, we just have these 4 countries, and then every other country goes in all chargeability areas. Yeah.
You said, thank you.
Yeah.
So I worked for rehab,
Mm-hmm.
and if you know, if someone from Mexico gets permanently disabled in the United States, they don't get deported,
Mm-hmm.
but they can't work except for a nonprofit.
So yeah, I mean, you can get things like humanitarian parole, but they're very difficult. The work permit processes, and I'll get to some of those updates about that, is even more difficult than it's been in the past.
Trust me, I know.
Yeah, exactly.
I worked that.
It's not built to be easily accessible or even understood. And that's the problem with it. And that's why we're kind of in the position we are now.
And so that was like, how do we resolve this case? It can't be. It has to stay on the books until something happens.
Yeah, no, I would get in Austin, when we had a much larger legal services department than we do here, we would get calls from hospitals all the time, and we're dealing with those types of situations and similar ones, and a lot of times there's not a good answer, unfortunately.
But then what do we do now, where our hospitals are going to be profit hospitals and not nonprofit hospitals? I can get someone trained to serve food and clean trays in a hospital.
Oh yeah. No, it's,
Now we're losing that one though.
yeah, no, I wish I had some positive news to give out when we get to it, but you seem to understand the assignment exactly. All right. So if you do make it through all of that, through all of that, then you actually now can apply for naturalization. Now, you must be a permanent resident for at least 3 years based on marriage or 5 years for any other reason. Again, there's multiple ways, as we discussed, to get to permanent residency. And once you are there, that is the minimum amount of years you must wait before applying for citizenship. Now, once you get within 6 months of one of those dates, then you can apply for citizenship. What is the final step? Y'all might have heard of this, but there is a U.S. civics exam, and another barrier for a lot of folks that do have permanent residency but can't get naturalized is you must be able to read and write and speak in English. That is, again, a big distinction between permanent residency and U.S. citizenship. So, historically, there was a 100-question bank that folks would be asked. You need to get 6 out of 10 of those questions correct. If you did that and then you were able to conversate and answer a written question, then you would pass and you would become a U.S. citizen. Now, some of the questions historically have been things like, who is the first U.S. president? When was the Declaration of Independence signed? Things of that nature. And just as a side note, if you want to see something that's both hilarious and sad, just get on YouTube and look at like man on the street civics test, U.S. citizen test, naturalization test. You will laugh and then also cry, mostly at the state of our education system here in the U.S. Yes.
So the New York Times just published an article on the update to these questions, which are now, in many cases, framed as Christian nationalist.
Very much so. And there, let's see, like one that didn't exist before, and it's one of the lighter ones, not as one of the stronger ones, but yes, they are. It's very much geared toward, I would say, an even better description is American exceptionalism. And one of the questions that's been added is name one American innovation, which is first we have to define innovation and whatever. But there have been historical ones like why did the U.S. enter World War I? What was the Civil War fought about? But that answer has now gotten a little more convoluted. Now you must answer, there's 128 questions, so now there's more questions, 28 more that you have to learn, and you must get 12 out of 20 instead of 6 out of 10 correct. Same percentage, you just have to get more raw questions correct. And yes, it's definitely been designed to make it, again, more difficult and with a much more American-centric slant as opposed to just what are the 3 branches of government and when was our country formed and kind of historical and civics facts like that. But if you do make it through that entire process, then you do become a U.S. citizen. You go to an oath ceremony, you swear to defend the Constitution, your hand drops, that's when you become a U.S. citizen. Now you can vote. And it is that point very difficult to deport you. The only way that you can be deported at that point is if it is proven that you used some fraudulent means to obtain either your permanent residency or your naturalization. Now I saw a question. Yes?
Yeah, what about small children?
I'm glad you asked. So, bringing it back to deriving or acquiring your citizenship, thank you for that question. If you are a minor child and you are a permanent resident, and hopefully your parent likes you enough to include you on their naturalization application, then you derive your citizenship from your parents. So you don't have to have a 5-year-old pass a U.S. civics test or prove that they can speak English, even though in many cases when I've gone to interviews, the 5-year-old child is the better speaker of the two. But that is not required. The child automatically gets that naturalization as soon as the parent is naturalized, again, as long as they're already a permanent resident and they are included on the naturalization application. Now, acquisition of U.S. citizenship is a little bit different. So if you are born in a foreign country, and I'm not talking like on a military base or something like that, and you have a parent or grandparent that was a U.S. citizen, and they meet several requirements, how long they spent in the U.S., when they left the U.S., things of that nature. If you meet all of those requirements, then you can apply to acquire your U.S. citizenship from abroad. And you never had to naturalize, and you weren't born on U.S. land, whether it was actual U.S. land or military bases in foreign countries. Now, a general example of this that you might, may or may not have at least witnessed, if not heard of, is the U.S. men's national soccer team. So there are several members we've had over the decades on the U.S. men's national soccer team that the first time that they come to the U.S., or maybe the second or third time they come to the U.S. their entire lives, is to begin training with the U.S. men's national team. That's typically because they grew up in some European country. They had a parent that was a foreign national of that country, a U.S. citizen parent. They have 2 passports because both countries allow for it. They didn't make the French team, so now they're going to come to the U.S. and play for the U.S. team. And so that's an example of folks that literally sometimes when they come here to play on the U.S. men's team, it's, they've been twice before to visit relatives, and this is their 3rd time ever in the country, and they're playing on our country's behalf. So that is acquiring your U.S. citizenship through someone else.
Does that require renouncing your former citizenship?
That depends, that's country to country. So for example, the U.S., the way it's worded essentially in the statute is, we really want you to renounce your citizenship, but we're not going to make you. I mean, that's literally how it's been read by the Supreme Court. Some countries, like I was mentioning with my brother-in-law's mom, she very much could, Canada was explicit in your situation, like I said, every situation is different. In your particular immigration situation, if you naturalize and become a US citizen, you have to renounce your Canadian citizenship. And actually, to that point, my brother-in-law had dual citizenship until he turned 18, and then Canada made him choose, and he chose US citizenship.
So our daughter is a Canadian citizen, born in this country, but has become a Canadian citizen, but she can still vote in the New York state election.
Yep.
That's where her last residency, so she can vote for the Senate race,
Mm-hmm.
she did, and the presidency.
Yep.
And have full Canadian citizenship.
Yeah, because it goes, we're okay with it going that way, but Canada is not okay with it coming this way. Like I said, it's different with every country. And Canada has much stricter laws in regards to that than the US. And that's kind of been a US tradition, is not asking folks to renounce their US citizenship. Again, it's recommended in the statutes, but yeah, not required. All right, so now we get to the folks that we help, the majority. Like I said, we help folks that aren't technically refugees or asylum seekers, but I would say the bulk of our clients fall into one of these 2 categories. Now, refugees and asylees are similar, like I said earlier, but they are not the same. A traditional refugee is someone who has fled their country for any reason. There could be war, there could be famine, there could be floods, whatever the case may be, but they fled their country because they did not feel safe living there. They went to a neighboring country typically, and then they resided in a refugee camp administered by one of, I believe, 3 different organizations, most predominantly the United Nations. And they remained in that camp for a certain amount of time, we'll get to in a little bit. And then a third-party country like the US has a group like y'all through a program that they apply to and then are accepted into that country. Now, an asylum seeker cannot apply for asylum from a foreign country. To be an asylum seeker, you have to get to the US. You either have to already be here, or you have to come to the border and make your asylum claim. And that's where a lot of the wording can get confusing, and where folks can say, well, there's all these undocumented individuals without, some sort of status here, and they're breaking the law. When technically, in the case of an asylum seeker, that's not true. When you come and you claim asylum, you are undocumented while you're going through your process. Now, after a certain amount of time, 150 days, you can apply to get your work permit after filing, but that's all you have is a work permit. You don't have any status. So you're still technically undocumented until you receive that asylum. So that's where it kind of gets a little bit confusing, because people are going through the right channels, the lawful way to get asylum. They're just classified as undocumented until they receive asylum or their asylum application is denied and they're removed from the United States. Now, yes?
There's a whole bunch of people in the Tacoma Detention Center.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know what are they? Refugees, asylum seekers, they're stuck there.
It's a mix. So whenever and this goes, pre-Trump, the first term, Whenever you have someone who comes to the United States undocumented and they go through they go to an inspection point and they declare asylum, whenever they are assigned a judge or a court specifically, a decision is made. They can either, historically there's been several options, but traditionally there's been the lightest, which is ROR, released on your own recognizance, where folks, hey, you need to show up at court on this date. If you don't show up, you'll be convicted in absentia and you'll have your asylum claim canceled, and we will make an active, investigation to deport you. Then they could also have kind of a halfway point where they were either having an ankle monitor bracelet or they were provided a free phone, but mostly it was locked to only be like a tracking device and make emergency calls so that they could be tracked while they were waiting for their asylum date. And then there are folks that are put straight into detention until their hearing, and they're allowed to come to court or leave the detention center only for their hearings, go to court. And then if it's determined they do have asylum, they're released. If not, then they're kept. And every case is a different situation. Typically, you will see folks who they can't find any record of, who come without passports, a lot of times end up at least in detention first. Whereas if it's a family and it can be confirmed that this is a family unit, at least of the liking of the Customs and Border Patrol, then they'll be released on their own recognizance. So in detention centers, it's a mix. You have asylum seekers, you have folks that were picked up on the interior, that never went through inspection. It just depends. It's unfortunately, everyone who is undocumented can technically end up there. It's just there's so many folks that are estimates in 11 to 14 million. We couldn't even put 1 million in even with our current admin structure. Yeah.
Was that function ever done by the government before it was found out to these contractors?
So did the government own the detention centers before it became private?
Yeah.
That's a good question. The entire time I've been an attorney, so that goes back to 2010, it's been for-profit, private detention centers. So previous to that, perhaps, but for at least the last 15 plus years, it's been private detention centers. That's a good point. It is just like private jails, a very, very profitable business, and many of them are publicly owned and traded. And so they emphasize stockholder value, not the humane treatment of the detainees, who, by the way, technically are not criminals. They've only violated a civil law. Yes?
Now, how do they get paid? Do they get paid per detainee? Do they get a lump sum?
Nope, they get paid just similar to, and it's Geo something, I forget the name of the biggest one, but they get paid similar to how most states who have private prisons pay, and it's on a per either inmate or detainee basis. And that's why a lot of kind of the issues around that is those companies have been seen to kind of encourage recidivism because it's better for them to have those folks just keep coming through the system than actually provide them a pathway to, straighten up once they get out, unfortunately. So yeah, those are the two main categories. I'm going to get into a little more detail about each one, but just to let y'all know, again, similar but different. So how does the refugee process work? As I said, you have to go to a camp, but you must be there for at least 2 years before you can even apply. The idea is that during that time, background checks can be run through whether it's Interpol, the FBI, whatever the case may be, to try to identify individuals that should not be eligible for refugee status. Now, that 2 years is a minimum. The average, last I saw, and it depends on, there's some argument about the data, about which type of refugees you include, and different regions have vastly different wait times. But if you take the whole bucket and just say, what's the average? It's about a dozen years. So somewhere between 10 to 12 years you spend in a refugee camp. As they say, in different areas, it's shorter or longer for different reasons, but that's the worldwide average. On top of that, typically less than 5% of refugees in camps are ever accepted by a third-party country. 95% of people that end up in refugee camps either live the rest of their lives there, they integrate into that country eventually where the refugee camp was founded, or whatever disaster, political situation has abated and they return home to their country, which does happen occasionally. It's not, the most often, but that did happen with several Syrian refugee camps once the regime was recently toppled. So it does happen occasionally, but 95% of the folks are ending up in those situations, not being accepted by the United States or a European country or somewhere else. Now, when I say it's decades, I mean it. We at Catholic Charities in Austin did not, again, do the reception and placement, but once refugees had their permanent residency for long enough and applied for citizenship, we helped out a lot of those folks. We had one guy who, a client that applied for citizenship. He was in a home for the disabled and elderly, and we actually had to have a judge go specifically to the home to do it. And it was a real nice ceremony. But he had spent over 25 years in a refugee camp before he was finally accepted into the United States. And you ask, well, why are the waits that long and then suddenly someone is accepted? Well, this individual was from an African country that's predominantly Muslim, had a very common name from that country, and was a single male. And those factors all essentially went against him, and people of different countries waiting to accept him into their country and eventually the United States. So, like I said, it can be decades, and for the vast majority of folks, they just live their lives there, or hopefully at some point can return to their home country. Now, refugees receive permanent residency and assistance in the U.S. for up to 5 years. So under the traditional refugee program that some of y'all are familiar with, what happened is a refugee gets that visa in the camp, comes to the United States on a visa. After 1 year, they apply for permanent residency, and then they can start the clock for their 5 years until U.S. citizenship. That's kind of why the statutory period is 5 years. That's the general idea. So they get refugee cash and medical assistance. A lot of folks do or did for the first year they're here. And then after that, they have access to employment assistance, language programs, case management, several different systems that can help them for up to 5 years. And the idea after that is they should be self-sufficient and integrated into the U.S. Yes?
Is a refugee camp rent-free?
Is a refugee camp rent-free? Like in a foreign country?
No, here.
Meaning like a...
Here and you're living in a refugee camp.
Gotcha, like at the one at Riverton Church you might have heard of. So yeah, those are usually run by the state. So for example, in Texas, the state government was very much against any refugee. They can actually, so again, to show you how this is different, but even between in the United States, in 2017, Governor Abbott refused to administer the refugee program anymore. And so Catholic Charities Fort Worth had to create a completely separate entity to essentially receive the federal money and then distribute it in place of the state. So while Washington State distributes refugee cash and medical assistance from their DSHS, from the Department of Health, we had to do it on a private. So each state is different. Now, Washington State has helped support different camps like the one at Riverton Church as a temporary situation until, and I can talk about this, until folks can come through the system to us through our WAMAS program, and then we can provide them case management and more stable housing and get them. So yes, it is rent-free, and then we try to get them into a more permanent situation, rent-free to begin with, and then hand off the lease to them, hopefully once they have their work permit. Yes?
Is the Riverton that you're explaining, is that the Methodist church that you contributed to?
Yes, it is actually. Yeah. So here's, oh, yes, sorry.
So while the detention and so forth is rent-free, they have to pay for their meals. They don't pay for that.
It depends at each camp. Like I said, we don't run any of those, and I have never run Texas wouldn't even allow them. Never run a refugee temporary like housing camp here. But from what I understand at Riverton, working with them as they refer folks through, is that they try to provide everything they can. Even at a recent legal services clinic they had, they were able to cover the cost of the employment document application. So it just depends on the church themselves.
I was thinking about the detention center in Tacoma.
Oh, the detention center. I thought, sorry, I didn't hear you correctly. No. The detention centers should be feeding them and not making them pay for it.
But they don't feed them, they have to buy it.
I was about to say, if they do, then that is a lawsuit waiting to happen. But no, the detention center, they should be fed. Now, there are things that are outside of taxpayer dollars, and actually an important part about the U.S. immigration system is everything I just have described up to this point, family-based, employment-based, all of that. Whenever you hear folks talk about the immigration system and they're like, we should defund it, well, there's only two out of the three parts of the immigration system that are funded by tax dollars. That's ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and CBP. U.S. Immigration, Citizenship and Immigration Services, which is the group that we apply to for everything from affirmative asylum to work permits, that is 98+% funded by USCIS filing fees. And if you've ever gone through the process or know someone who has, it can literally be anywhere from hundreds, and in most cases, if you go all the way to citizenship, thousands or tens of thousands of dollars in filing fees. And the citizen, so the USCIS is actually paid for by that system, so it's actually a net add in that way. So whenever, as a immigration advocate and attorney, whenever folks would cry out for defunding the immigration system, I'm like, sounds fantastic. Thanks. Go ahead and get ICE and CPP shut down, and we'll go ahead and put all that money into USCIS. So yeah, it's not great, and the detention centers do, regardless of that situation. I've been to them. I've been to ones at the border. I've been to ones in Texas. They are meant to make a profit, and the way they treat folks there, it shows. Yes?
So is it correct to assume that refugee camps are really, they're not refugee camps in this country, are they?
No. Those are just temporary housing situation. A refugee camp in the statutory definition I'm talking about, run by one of those three international organizations like the UN, there hasn't been one here, because typically when folks would come here, they're just going to claim asylum, so it wouldn't.
So Riverside United Methodist Church is not a refugee camp, it's a place where there are refugees that are being funded by various faith groups and some a little bit of government than we used to be.
Correct. You can say that they are refugee camps in spirit, and that there are folks there that are seeking asylum status, asylee status, and are staying there for free, like they would if it was a traditional refugee camp. But no, they're not one of the official ones that are run by the UN that would go through this process.
Well, would that count as for a prospective immigrant?
Mm-hmm.
If they were at Riverton for 25 years, would that count?
No, not for refugee status. You have to be outside the country to apply for that. But they could ask for asylum, and that's what you would do in that situation. That's the vast majority of legal services that I'll talk about later that are funded by the state are going to help folks apply for asylum and then get their work permit, and then if they have families still in the countries they fled from, helping those folks come over. So to give you an idea of, I'm sure, something that you're acutely aware of, but with some historical perspective, where we started and where we are with the traditional refugee program that I just described, going through the camps and everything. Beginning in 1980, with the Refugee Act I spoke of earlier, we began letting in, obviously you're gonna have a huge jump that first year because we haven't had this program up and running like it is in its modern incarnation. So bam, you had a spike, but then you had, pretty steady up until 2001. I think we can all probably remember what happened in 2001 that then caused our refugee numbers to dip for a while, but then you see they started building up again until 2017. I think you can pretty much figure out what happened in 2017 that led to them gradually decreasing, and then what happened in 2021 that led to them increasing. So this is by 50,000 person increments, the amount of refugee entrants. This isn't the cap number. This is the amount of actual individuals who came in under the refugee program. Now, for the fiscal year 25, so the federal fiscal year, if you're not familiar with it, starts October 1st. So that started October 1st of 2024 and ended in September of 2025. We admitted 27,000 refugees before they were suspended in January. And then since that time, which now has ended, as we are in fiscal year 26, only additional 340 white Afrikaners were admitted. And I just heard this.
You missed that, rich Afrikaners.
Yes, the very much oppressed ones. And unfortunately, this year for FY26, the number they're trying to set where it was, usually you try to get in the six figures. 125,000 was where we were aiming for in planning for FY26. It has now been reduced to 7,500, and also only admitting white Afrikaners and other designated populations. So the refugee program, for all intents and purposes, has been sidelined. Now we remain parts of, since we do have a refugee resettlement part, which is not under me, but it's part of LCS. We are still retaining, as I was mentioning before the presentation, some of that staff in hopes that when it comes back, we can help. Now, again, we are obliged to and will help if designated by the U.S. government, folks that come here under the current program. But as of today, we have a statewide meetings every month. There has been no Afrikaners that have requested to be resettled in the Pacific Northwest, let alone Washington. So that has not been an issue as of yet, but it could be if they do get closer, instead of 340, closer to that 7,500 number. We'll just have to see. But for all intents and purposes, that's the only part of the refugee program that still exists right now. Okay, so that is the refugee program. Again, now we're talking about asylees. Again, asylum seekers must make their claim inside the U.S. or at the U.S. border. There's affirmative and there's defensive. Now, affirmative is if you're already inside of the U.S. and you need to make an asylum claim. It's like, well, how would that happen? I can give you a real-world example. So we worked a lot with a Turkish group in Austin. Many of the folks there were students at UT. And after the not really recent anymore, after the coup attempt several years ago, the leader of that country blamed a certain sect of Islam that had been predominant in Turkey, but now was essentially persona non grata, and blamed the coup on this subgroup in their country and started shutting down their businesses, emptying their bank accounts, taking their passports. And this was happening to family members of folks that were at this particular mosque we were working with. And so they came here as students. They were here on student visas, but then circumstances changed in their home country. So then they decided, hey, now we're going to make an asylum claim. So they can do that affirmatively, which means they go straight to USCIS, as I mentioned, U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, and they say, hey, I'm here lawfully, but I want to apply to be here as an asylee and then eventually a permanent resident. Most folks go through the defensive claim. So the defensive is whenever you come to the border and make your claim. One of my clients from Cameroon that I had in Austin, went from Cameroon to a neighboring African country, flew to Mexico City, took a bus from Mexico City to the border with Texas, ended up in a detention center for about a week, and then was released on his own recognizance in San Antonio, Texas. So that is someone who went through the defensive claim. When they came to the border, he was assigned a court and assigned a date to appear in court, and then eventually found me as his attorney, and we went to immigration court and made his case, and thankfully he was approved. And whenever I left Austin, we had already gotten him all the way through permanent residency, and we're in the process of bringing over his wife and kids. So hopefully things go well over the next few months. They'll be able to reunite after almost a decade. So that is a typical asylee's journey. You come through, you go to the border, you ask for asylum, and then you go through the immigration court process. Interesting fact about the immigration court, those are not independent courts. If you eventually appeal enough, you can still get to the Supreme Court, but it's actually not an Article 3 court. It's under the executive in Article 1. The Department of Justice is the boss of the immigration judges. So literally the Attorney General, and this has happened throughout history, can take a decision, put an X through it and rewrite it regardless of precedent, because they are not independent judges. They are employees of the Department of Justice. And so now we're seeing a changing of folks that have been there, judges that have been there for decades are leaving, and they're being replaced with certain judges that have certain outlooks on immigration, and that's 100% legal because, again, it's not under Article 3, it's under the Department of Justice. Saw a question over here.
How long is it on the defensive claims when they get to the border? How long do they have to wait before they see the court?
Yes.
And what do they do in the meantime?
Also, yes, that is a good question. So currently, we have folks that are coming in with what are called NTAs, notices to appear, some all the way out to 2028. Yeah, and so here's what you can do. If you claim asylum, which is not as easy as just saying, things are bad where I'm from, and I'll get to that in a little bit, it's a little more specific than that. If you are able to claim asylum, you put in your application for asylum. After 150 days after filing, you can apply for a work permit, but then you have to wait for that to be issued, which takes another several months. And so you're talking about from the time you get here, best case scenario, 8 or 9 months, if you filed your asylum application, which never happens on the first day, your work permit's at least 8 or 9 months out. Most folks, it's from when they really enter to get their work permits, usually in the 12 to 18 month range. And essentially in those times, they're either working under the table or they are getting benefits from groups like us or working with churches like y'all or some combination.
Justin, I'm just thinking about time that usually we try to wind up by 12:15.
Yes.
People can certainly stay and
Ask questions. All right, so I'll go ahead and get through the presentation and then we can do some more questions afterwards. I do hope. There we go.
We have a timeout.
Let's see if it comes back. There it is. All right, so I'll go ahead and get these through these last slides, and then yes, I can stay after and answer questions if y'all have any additional ones. So that's how it works between affirmative and defensive. Now, for asylum, you can only claim asylum based on one of 5 reasons: race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. You will not see there economic hardship or running from a drug cartel or famine. Those are not eligible. Where a refugee can go to a refugee camp and wait for decades, and that be reasons that are eligible. For an asylum seeker, it has to be persecution or fear of for one of these 4 reasons, or membership in a particular social group. Now that might sound like a broad catch-all, but it's actually quite narrow. An example would be if you're homosexual in a country that outlaws homosexuality or doesn't protect you from like roving gangs that commit violence, then you're a member of a particular social group that is persecuted by the state. Again, cartels don't count. So a lot of folks that are fleeing that we've assisted, it's really hard to get them an asylum claim, even though it is literally life or death. Most males are given a choice in many Central American countries around 10 or 12 years old, either join the gang or die, and they usually hop, if they choose to not join the gang, they hop on a train or start the long track here to the United States, but not traditionally eligible for asylum. Additional forms, we've got DACA, many of y'all have heard of. So those are folks that came here as children, and there's a certain time when they had to arrive and how old they were. They can get DACA, which is a temporary, not full status, but allows them to have a work permit and renew it every 2 years as long as they have graduated high school, don't commit crimes, that sort of thing. Temporary protective status, that's essentially short-term asylum for designated places. Unfortunately, again, that's controlled by the executive, and we've seen a lot of folks that have been here for a while because things have not improved in their home countries are losing their TPS. SIVs are for those folks that helped us in Afghanistan or Iraq, either working for the US government or working for a contractor of the US government. They have a special type of visa. And then traditional visa lottery that was created to essentially increase immigration from countries that do not have high levels of migration to the US to essentially diversify our cultural base. An example, Mexico is not on that list where you can apply for visa lottery, but Russia has been traditionally in the past. So that's an example. Quickly, updates, as I mentioned, the TPS countries that have been that have lost their status, which means once the status terminates in its current timeline, they have to either return home or apply for a different status. Those are all the countries from Afghanistan to Nepal that have lost it in the last 9 months. Because again, it comes up every 18 months and it's 100% at the executive's discretion, like much of immigration law is, whether or not to renew or terminate. DACA, there hasn't been a new applicant, both due to aging out, but with the original legislation, but due to court orders, even when folks were still eligible to age-wise, because it's been stuck in the courts now since 2017 with no new applicants. If you had DACA before 2017, you could continue to renew, but it's been trapped in both Trump 1, Joe Biden's administration, and now Trump's second administration, where no new applicants have been accepted, and it's getting to the point, it's eventually going to get to the Supreme Court, and I'm not very optimistic that it is going to survive the Supreme Court, which means all those folks that might have had it since 2012 when the program started, they've had work permits, they've been able to live here lawfully. Many of them came when they were like between 0 to 5 years old, so they don't even know where they would go back to, would immediately be eligible for deportation. Already mentioned the refugee program being suspended, except for a few Afrikaners. The arrests, as I'm sure anyone who's paid attention to the news, have increased significantly under this administration. And they've gone places traditionally that folks haven't gone unless they already had a pre-existing warrant. Like I said, if you are an asylum seeker, you have to go to immigration court and you're technically undocumented until you get that asylum status, that asylee status. Well, a trick that was happening for folks that had arrived within the last 2 years is they're eligible for what's called an expedited removal, and they would be essentially tricked by the trial attorney and the immigration judge in some cases, sometimes just the trial attorney, to have their case dismissed. They think that's great, my case is dismissed, but also their asylum claim is dismissed, and there were ICE agents literally waiting outside of the immigration court now that that protection is gone, because their case is dismissed, and removing them and putting them in expedited deportation because they'd been here less than 2 years. So that had never happened before. ICE check-ins, again, where people are doing the right thing, going through their different processes, they go to the check-in like some had been going to for over a decade, and then ICE picks them up and puts them in a detention center. And then even naturalization interviews for what I would consider incredibly small infractions or mistakes on naturalization applications, like not putting that they were part of a certain group, like club in school whenever they were 18, 19 years old, using that as justification to say that it was a fraudulent application. The latest issue is there's no more auto extension on those work permits. So however you get your work permit, if you're renewing it and it's eligible for renewal, as soon as you send in that renewal and get that receipt from the government, you get a 540-day extension past the expiration date, so they have time to process that. That has ended as of October 30th. So now, even though it takes months to get it renewed and you can't apply until it gets close to renewal, you're having folks that are having gap in their work authorization and employers that are having to make the hard decision of whether or not to retain them and then technically be violating the law and making themselves eligible for not just fines but criminal prosecution, or terminating that person or putting them on some sort of leave. Yeah. Finally, to speed through it, as I know we're now at 12:17, quick, just knowing your rights for anyone. This is good for anyone, in my opinion, who's in the US, but just to know for anyone who might be extremely vulnerable. Law enforcement, including ICE, can enter any public space for actions. If it is a public open space that anyone can walk in at any time, ICE is allowed to go in there. But if there's, let's say at LCSNW, a locked area, like once you get past reception, they cannot go into there without a warrant or probable cause, meaning if someone they knew they had an arrest warrant for and they were chasing them and they busted through the locked door somehow, they would be allowed to pursue them. But unless they have that situation or a warrant for the property, they cannot go in the locked areas. Arrest warrants for ICE, and this is something that I was doing Know Your Rights presentations in Texas last decade trying to emphasize. Arrest warrants for ICE very rarely are search warrants. They just have the name of the individual and that they are to be arrested and detained by ICE. So if they are in a place where they cannot get into, and you might have seen a recent example of this, like their house, one man ran into his house, they didn't have the warrant, or they didn't have the probable cause because they didn't officially know that he was in there, but they thought he was. So his daughter had been left in the car, and they were essentially holding the daughter hostage to get the men to come out, or they were going to take her to foster care, and so he eventually came out and they arrested him. You can put some form of that into Google and read the details of it. It was pretty horrific, and that's just one of many stories you may or may not have seen. Like I said, private domiciles are not accessible without a search warrant, not an arrest warrant, but there is little to no protection from being detained on the street, in your car, or other public places. You just need a very low bar for being detained, which is called reasonable suspicion, and then to be arrested, probable cause. But it's not, it is not a very high bar to clear, and you can be searched in many cases pretty aggressively. But it's always important to remember, you don't have to say anything, and you can say, I don't consent to this search. The search may happen, but then you can let a judge sort out the bodies in the end. Real quickly, I grew up next to the US-Mexico border. Here I know we're close to the US-Canadian border, but it is similar in that there are some important facts. You have way fewer rights near the border. Within 100 miles of the border, CBP has a lot more leeway on what they can do. For example, they can set up internal checkpoints. Some of y'all might have run into those. They're very famous in South Texas when you're driving back up from the border. They can board any public transport. They can conduct roving patrols. It's much, much more open within the border. And it's also very important to remember, as you know, this force has now been funded more than the vast majority of militaries in the United States over the next 10 years in this last bill. CBP has one of the largest jurisdictions of people in the US, next to groups like the FBI and the DEA. And the reason they do is they have this ability within 100 miles of the border to do all of these actions, but that's every border. That's not just US and Mexico, that's all the oceans. So literally New York City, Miami, Seattle, Houston, Jacksonville, you know, like all of these coastal cities, Detroit, New York City are all within CBP's jurisdiction. And now they are going to have way more funding to have actions within that area. And finally, I'll just let this sit up here for a second there instead of going through all of them. There are many different, and I'll make sure to send this to y'all so you can, this is free to distribute far and wide, not trademarked. Just remember that this was all correct at this point in time. And immigration law in general changes somewhat frequently, and under this current administration changes a lot every day. So it is as good as the day that, you know, it was shown. There are several different things from the state that are provided. Like for us, we are part of the WAMAS program. We provide case management, housing assistance, and legal services. There are different ways to receive food assistance, hopefully again, and limited English assistance as well. So that is, see if I can actually land on it. There we go. That's the whole presentation. I'd love to answer any questions that y'all have if you want to stay longer, but if you need to go, please do. But thank you all so much for having me. I really appreciate it. Do you want me to stay up here for questions, or do you want me to stay up here for questions, or just talk on the side? Okay, cool. So if you want to come, just go ahead and come on up, and I can answer any other questions.
Thanks so much for coming. I really meet somebody.
Oh, please go ahead. Yeah, I know we're way over time.
Yeah, that's great. And
I'll go ahead and I'll forward this to y'all, and then you know, if there's anything that y'all want to be involved in, or you know, like one of the things I used to use Catholic churches for, like legal clinics, stuff like that.
send us those kind of things too.
Will do.
Yeah.
Great. Appreciate it. Thank you.
So how is your funding stream?
Sure. So the majority of our funding.
I know you're not here to ask for funds.
No. But yeah, but it's I mean, it's all public information. So our funding stream is primarily for the RIS program specifically, which is what I know, is about, I'd say at this point, 60 pass-through federal and 40 state-owned funds. And then, of course, as needed, we can use the general donated funds to fill in any gaps that come in the budget.
So you're using that as a sort of a filler.
Correct, if necessary,
yeah.
Because you never know, and this is true across, you never know which program, like it might be Seniors for Santa that needs it this year, or Aging and Independent Living, or, another program to, sometimes it's to see if we can weather any storm. Sometimes if we know, like the Refugee and Placement Program, Reception and Placement Program, to give folks like at least a month of severance or so that, they can have time to find other employment. But yeah, it's the vast majority federal and state now. What we're trying to do is what I had in Austin. I started out as immigration legal services, and we had some grants that kept our prices low, but we offered every type of service just like we're a normal law firm, but for heavily discounted prices. And about 40% of our funding came from those client fees that were about 60 to 80% discounted from the private attorney. You had to still be below a certain line of poverty and everything. So we're trying to expand that also within the RIS program. We have a separate legal services program that's in different offices, that's not really centralized where the refugee program is, and so we have to refer folks. So we're trying to get our own and grow that fee base so that hopefully, it gives us another revenue stream to kind of answer your question, and secondarily, a lot of our clients need help with things that aren't usually covered by grants, like family-based immigration. Folks that have been here for decades and they qualify for marriage base, they meet certain qualifications, but it's either pay $7,000 or go it alone. And so we're trying to find that niche, just like we had in Austin, to where we can provide those services. But yeah, right now, it's all funded by grants in about 60 federal, 40 states.
So it's a federal grant.
Yes, yeah, so that's solely due to the fact that many of these...
1224.
Exactly. Is that a lot of these have been passed through the states already, and like they're in like the bank account with the states, and it's more of a pain to retract them, so they're just not going to give any more funds, but they usually come in 2 or 3 year spurts. So for some programs we're funded through 27, at least partially. Some were funded through this fiscal year 26, but depending on what happens with the midterms, it could drastically affect how it works. And just to be honest, like one of the reasons I came up here is I was fighting both the federal government and my state government. And we had, we already had to do all those hoops I talked about earlier to keep the refugee program after 2017 going. The state blocked federal, like the feds had given it to 49 other states, so Alabama, Mississippi. Federal funds are at the beginning of this year, but our state government blocked it on the down low and essentially dragged it out until like late March, to where the diocese was like, we floated these, we don't know if we're getting paid for this. Eventually they did get paid back for the back pay, but then I had to lay off 50 employees. Yeah, and so which was about 2/3 of my staff. And then on top of that, the state is actively trying to make sure that like we had contracts with the city and the county, Austin and Travis County, trying to make that illegal. They didn't pass it this
Austin
cycle.
is the only liberal place in the state.
Yeah, like the cities like Dallas and Houston have gotten more blue, but yeah, it is the heart of that, and that's why for the entire time I was at Catholic Charities, it was like Austin would pass something that would be beneficial to our clients, or it would fund us, and they were trying to find a way to block it. Yeah, it's.
Do you know what the status is of the 2 families that we have helped?
I do not.
Is there any way to find that out?
I can certainly ask. Like I said, I think we have I think our skeleton crew that's remaining from the reception and placement division that would have assisted those 2 families. I think we still have like 1 or 2 employees. I just don't know how far back they go, because we don't know.
I think it would be really good for this congregation
just
to know what the status is now and
if
what
y'all want to
they've
shoot
been
me
doing.
the,
You have the card.
I do, and I wonder if I brought it. But I do have, I can go, I want to take a picture of that. It does have my email address on it, but
What's the size of your staff?
So currently I have, once we get our new hires on the 17th, it'll be 22, spread across 3 different programs.
So our
With the jurisdiction of just in Washington State or down to?
I don't have my I'm sorry.
I'll go get one.
Yeah. So the LCS covers, or LCSNW covers all 3 states. So we have Boise, Idaho, and then several offices in Oregon and Washington, and then we're split into 6 districts. So my office is in the Greater Puget Sound district. So I cover basically any county that touches the Sound. So we go, south to little south of Tacoma, all the way north to the border.
It's so interesting. This presentation is so valuable because we think that you provide furniture to people that come.
Right.
It's a little more. Kind of been our right. Our experience. You're doing the whole thing.
Trying to, yeah. Like I said, we're attempting to expand even in,
Why is every day an outrage? That's what I want to know.
Well, it's kind of, if you watch Star Wars, there's been a TV show, Andor, that they came out with, and one of the lines about the Empire is, they have so many atrocities, it's easier to hide behind 40 than 1. And that's the thing, it's a new outrage every day, and I think that's earlier, like part of the game, like part of the intent.
I don't think it's part of it. I think it is the intent.
Yeah, it is the intent.
It is.
Right. No,
so our daughters were born in India.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. I thought that was great.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate it.
Was there ever anything that we should have done legally?
Well, I mean, if they are able to get their passports now, then there's nothing else you should have done.
They had State Department issued passports when they were born, basically.
Exactly, and that's if you went through the State Department, then you did what you were supposed to do. Yeah, no, so you're 100% fine.
Oh, it suddenly occurred to me that maybe they're not really legal.
No. If you went through the Department of State, then you did the right thing. The acquisition is if you have like no affiliation with it. Like, for example, my uncle he had my cousin before he moved, but he married a Mexican national in Texas and then moved to the Yucatan Peninsula to start an English school of all things. If my cousin had been born once they moved, then he would go through the acquisition process because there was not involved with anything that would touch the Department of State.
Well, this is really good, we live at a retirement center just down the street, and I think it would be really good for you to come there.
Oh, absolutely. We would love to. That's what I always tell folks is if you have, Rotary clubs to other congregations to, a friend group, I'm happy to give this anywhere.
I think it was really informative and.
Thank you. I appreciate
and really, I learned a lot.
I did too. I was going to say, it's very clear, and even those of us who probably read all the news about these things, you clarified a number of things today you had never fully understood.
I appreciate that. Oh, thank you.
Thank you so much.
No, thank you all for coming. I appreciate it.
I'm going to give your address to the guy who does our lifelong learning program.
Perfect.
Because I just think this is just important, and I think people would really like to.
I'd love to present. That'd be awesome. Yeah, just have them email me and I'll get in touch.
Great.
Thank you so much.
So the organization supports people who are not Lutherans,
Yes.
I assume?
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, I'm Catholic and I run one of the programs. So yeah, 100%. No, it's and like even Catholic Charities, which had like certain requirements I don't even think Lutheran has, where like directors of programs had to be Catholic, but any other employee could be whatever. And most of my employees actually came in Austin came from once they had the refugee program, came either through the refugee process or immigrants. And here at Lutheran, I would say about 80% of my staff is either an immigrant or a former refugee.
One thing I noticed in your presentation, you never really addressed, for instance, potential for asylum for somebody who has entered through the process of not checking in.
Oh yeah, like going around. Yeah.
Right. So does the agency help advise people in that status?
Sure. So like, for example, the advice in general terms that I would give someone, let's say, who went around the border, but they did have like a valid claim back in their home country for one of the allowable reasons. They would run into a couple of barriers. So the first one would be you're supposed to apply for asylum within a year of entering the U.S. Even if you go around a point of entry. I've helped clients that did that, then came back. If you need to get up here.
I'm just going to turn the Zoom on.
What they would do is, come to us, let's say 2-3 years after they entered, and then we would have to say, okay, well, you're supposed to apply within a year of entry, and if it's above that, then you have to have a good reason for not applying. And it could be like I was, in a hospital, or I was trying to find a suitable attorney, and those can be reasons. But that's why it's hard for someone who, like, say, went around the border, waited a decade to apply for asylum. It would be a much more difficult argument. Why did you wait past the 1-year deadline?
And one specific case I'm interested in is, can you apply for, like if you apply for a student visa, someone who came around the border, you said it, and wants to find a way to become legally resident, can you apply for a student visa
once you're here? No.
Or is that,
it would be, so to get a student visa, and that actually has a multiple step process that actually adds on to the federal government. So to get a student visa, first you have to be accepted by a university, and then they have to stamp and issue a certain form, and then you include that form with your student visa application or your student visa renewal. And so you have to be able to prove that A, the university has me here, and B, that, I pass all of the background checks and everything still. So if you're here undocumented, you're ineligible to get that form from that university. You have to be outside the country and then apply.
Okay. I have a couple other questions I might like to ask you in a more confidential setting. Not here just
for sure.
Because I'm understanding not because of you, because I assume you have to be very, very careful.
Of course. If it involves people's identities, then yes, it must be confidential.
So would it be possible to call you or use email?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Emailing
absolutely. If you had the...
I have email.
Okay, good, yeah.
So my name is Peter Anderson, so I'll send you a...
Please do, and then we can arrange to either, chat over Teams or Zoom or the phone, whatever works.
Okay, all right.
Cool, good to meet you.
So I have a friend.
Well, this was a river cruise where you were sure.
He's Iranian, and he's You're
been,
totally pampered. I mean, what it is, I
he
don't
feels
care
he's
where you
safe
walk.
here.
Yeah.
His problem is he
Well,
has
I
some
can be careful
paperwork
like that once
that
you're
needs
here.
done, and I cannot seem to
I don't care
find
if it's on the
anywhere,
water,
any way
Mhm.
to get him a type of tutoring so that he's able to do written English. He speaks broken English.
Is he
But
currently
to
is he currently a permanent resident trying to naturalize and become a U.S. citizen, or is he still before? Because
I'm not
okay,
completely sure. He is significant other, he's been here a number of years.
okay.